So this is actually a piece out of a novella that is going to be published soon. And it's in the novella as a different form. I thought somehow when we were deciding what to read tonight that we were supposed to read something that had never been published or read. I don't know where I got that. I was clearly inebriated. This is called Red Tide. Grandpa said the red tide was coming to the mangroves, our mangroves. Like Pharaoh's plague, I asked. He smiled at me and said, "You do have a funny way of putting things, child. But yes, I suppose the red tide is a plague of sorts. It'll certainly kill all my fish if it gets bad enough." "Will it?" "Let's hope not, Lily." We watched the water around our island for signs and checked with Eldred regularly. Eldred was Grandpa's best friend. He owned the closest marina to Little Gasparilla Island, and we played poker with him and Grandpa's other buddies at the marina on Thursday nights. We didn't tell Aunt June. Eldred said it didn't look too bad, that maybe Grandpa would still be able to take those rich city boys out for a string of redfish. Grandpa talked about how we could all survive okay if the algae bloom didn't get too thick. I thought about their words and wondered how a thing as beautiful as a bloom could kill. I felt sad inside at the thought. I wondered how dying could be better for one creature and worse for another. The red tide did get worse. "Worst bloom I've ever seen," Grandpa said. Pigfish and greenies gave up and floated belly high on the red-brown water. The mangroves that lined our dock smelled horrible, and you couldn't even see the sand under your feet out in the Gulf. Death was everywhere. Grandpa and I left the island every day to see the damage. It was like we were drawn to the horror, like the moths that bumped into the porch light downstairs of our stilt house. From a distance, the dead greenies shimmered like silver dollars in the water. But when Grandpa slowed the boat, the stench of bloated fish filled your nose. The algae breath stung, too. It burned your nostrils and made your eyes water. The tides kept running, but we didn't even bother to fish. There was no point. Aunt June called up every couple of days right after the local news and reminded Grandpa that it wasn't good for me to swim in the bacteria. "Algae," he corrected her. "Well, whatever it is, Lily shouldn't be out in it." "No, June," he said. "I know." Since Mama and I used to spend our summers in the mountains, I had never seen the red tide. After a couple of weeks, I'd seen all I wanted. The dying fish made me think of Mama's funeral. But instead of the priest's last words, all I could remember was the great white heron that picked its way through the St. Augustine toward us. I imagined him now, his feet stepping high, wading through bloody water. The next time Aunt June called, she said she was coming out to check on us. Said she was bringing supper and a cake, and that Grandpa was to pick her up the next morning at Eldred's at 9. "Well, I suppose it can't be helped," Grandpa said. So he ran the vacuum and I did some laundry. Neither one of us wanted to hear Aunt June click her tongue. The next morning, Grandpa took the skiff to the marina and I stayed back. I thought about Aunt June, all alone in her big old house, and kind of felt sorry for her. After all, she had been Mama's big sister. I wondered what it felt like to have a sister. I thought about last summer when Mama had pulled me close and we had looked up at the night sky full of stars. "You know, Aunt June used to let me sleep with her at night when I got scared." "Really?" "Yeah, she would let me count the stars like this until I fell asleep." Mama had looked up into the night sky and I had waited for her to go on. She's a good big sister, Lily. As Aunt June climbed out of Grandpa's boat, I tried to imagine her as a young girl, comforting Mama in the starlight of their bedroom, but it was hard. "Here, Lily," she said when I got to the boat. "Take the cake and watch the lid so it doesn't ruin the icing." She handed it up to me and turned to Grandpa. "Think you can manage the pot roast?" "Of course," he said. He helped her out of the boat. "Then hand me the casserole. Lord, this red tide is awful. You two should really come inland till it's over." Aunt June fussed around inside the house all morning, cleaning corners and rearranging stuff in the fridge. Grandpa left almost as soon as she got started. Said he had to go check with Eldred about something. I knew what he was doing. After lunch, I told Aunt June I wanted to go outside and play, even though I didn't really want to be out there with all those dead fish. But I didn't want to be inside either. I was thinking about going to the beach, but I knew I couldn't swim, and the mosquitoes were so bad in the brush that I headed back to the dock. Our dock went from the stairs of the stilt house, through the mangroves, and almost all the way to the sandbar in the bay. I walked out to the end and tried to feel a breeze. but it was August. Grandpa was still out on the boat, and I didn't know what to do with myself, so I headed back in through the trees and watched the fish trying to breathe in the dark water. They just floated there in the red tide, trapped in a forest of roots, unable to escape. As I watched them slowly die, one redfish looked at me and sank beneath the surface. She just drifted below the water, watching me with her one open eye. I had to do something. I ran over to where Grandpa cleaned the fish and filled a big bucket with fresh water from the hose and carried it into the shade where the fish were being pushed by the mangroves, into the mangroves by the tide. I ran upstairs and got the box of Morton salt from the cupboard. I ran to the shed and grabbed Grandpa's waders and a net. At the dock, I poured a cup of salt into the bucket and pulled on the huge boots and jumped into the shallow water. Aunt June hollered something out the screen door, but I couldn't understand her. As fast as I could reach them, I scooped up the dying fish and stumbled through the muck to the bucket on the top step. I put the poor creatures in the fresh water and pulled their bodies back and forth the way I'd seen Grandpa do, but like Mama, they didn't want to live. I sloshed to the dock with a dead fish in my hand and remembered finding Mama in the bathtub, swimming in red water, her hair curling around her like a mermaid. Only the top of her head and one shoulder peeked above the tide. I looked at the fish I held in my hand. "Live," I sobbed. "Why don't you want to live?" I looked up, and there was Aunt June on the dock. I thought she would scold me for yelling and splashing around in the mud, but instead her mouth twisted up in a knot, and she started crying too. She came right over and knelt near the steps. "Let me," she said. She grabbed the bucket and held its rope like a rosary while I gathered as many fish as I could reach and tried to make them live. When one wouldn't breathe, I laid it on the wet wood beside the others and tried again. The longer my row of dead fish grew, the harder I tried. By the time Grandpa returned, I had flung myself down on the darkened dock with the fish. I was soaked in salt water. My eyes stung with red tide, and my hands were raw from clutching at their fins, but not one of them survived. Grandpa reached for the bucket. "Here," he said. He poured off the water and filled the bucket with their bodies and carried them behind the stilt porch to bury them. Aunt June went upstairs, her hands over her face. I walked out to the end of the dock. I listened to Grandpa making their sandy grave as the tide slapped the pilings beneath me. The scrape of his shovel in the lap of the water made a sad song. After a while, a stillness came and sat with me, and the sun shone in white patches, like 100 white herons across the bay.